Truth does not arrive to comfort us. It arrives to dismantle the illusions we cling to. And nowhere is this dismantling more ruthless than in Machiavelli's confrontation with our fantasies about goodness, virtue, and political innocence. He exposes what history has whispered all along. Power is not guided by moral purity, and societies do not collapse because leaders are wicked, but because they misunderstand the human animal. Long before the crisis of public trust that defined the years leading toward 2025, he revealed that the real danger is not cruelty, but naivety. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. But let us return to the fracture Machiavelli forces open. He does not invite us to improve ourselves. He demands that we confront what we are. He strips political life of its comforting myths and insists that survival, fear, desire, and collective instinct shape the world far more than the virtues we pretend to uphold. In modern terms, he stands at the origin of power psychology, revealing how groups behave long before we had the language to describe such behavior. This opening is not meant to praise him. It is meant to engage him, to allow his brutal clarity to echo into our moment of mass persuasion, emotional manipulation, and institutional fragility. And as we cross this threshold, the path forward becomes clear. We must descend into the 10 reflections that follow, each one peeling another layer off the machinery of power, each one pressing us closer to the uncomfortable truth that underlies the entire body of the work. Truth begins by breaking your illusions, and Machiavelli breaks them with a precision that feels almost surgical. He does not argue against morality. He reveals its powerlessness the moment it meets the reality of human behavior. He does not mock virtue. He exposes the distance between what we admire and what we actually do when survival presses its hand against our throat. Before the world wrapped political life in ideals, before modern psychology dissected the human mind, he had already done the brutal work of forcing us to confront the creature that lives beneath our flattering self-image. That creature is not the moral self we wish to display, but the survival self that acts long before virtue enters the room. This is why Machiavelli's opening strike is so devastating. He introduces the idea of effectual truth, the truth that works, the truth that operates within the machinery of the world as it is, not as we hope it might be. He dismantles the dream that politics can be an extension of ethics, that governance is an art of righteousness, that power rewards goodness. For him, the question is not what a ruler should be in the realm of ideals, but what a ruler must be in the arena of necessity. And once this distinction appears, everything soft, noble, and comforting begins to burn away. The tension he reveals is ancient, but uncomfortable to admit. There is a moral self that imagines how we should behave, how leaders should act, how societies should operate. But beneath it lives a survival self, driven by fear, desire, ambition, belonging, and the instinct to secure advantage in a competitive world. Machiavelli does not choose one over the other. He simply says the moral self does not rule. The survival self does. To build a political philosophy on the moral self is to construct a palace on sand. To govern human beings, one must understand the self that actually moves them. This recognition does not degrade humanity. It clarifies it. Machiavelli forces us to see the psychological struggle operating inside every individual and every institution. We want to be good, but we need to survive. We aspire to be principled, but we respond to pressure. We admire virtue, but we reward effectiveness. A leader who lives only by moral truth will be destroyed by those who do not. A people who expect purity from their rulers will be disappointed again and again because they demand from politics what politics cannot give. Effectual truth replaces ideal truth, not because ideals are unworthy, but because they are weak when left unshielded. This becomes unmistakably relevant in the world of 2025, where the moral self is displayed constantly on digital stages, while the survival self hides behind algorithms, strategies, and public narratives crafted for performance. The modern individual is torn between the desire to appear good and the need to navigate systems that reward manipulation, opportunism, and tactical adaptation. Social media amplifies the moral pose, while real decisions are shaped quietly by fear of exclusion, hunger for influence, and the instinct to maintain control. Machiavelli would not be surprised. He knew, centuries ago, that image and action often diverge, and that the desire to be loved collapses under the necessity to be effective. Effectual truth does not reject morality. It refuses to let morality blind us. It demands that we examine the emotional anatomy of political behavior. Why does fear move crowds faster than reason? Why does desire for belonging overpower ethical conviction? Why do people trade freedom for security when uncertainty rises? These are psychological questions, not philosophical ones. And Machiavelli understood them long before human behavior became a scientific field. He knew that people act from instinct first and principle later, that idealism hardens into tribalism under threat, and that a leader who fails to anticipate the emotional volatility, the populace will not remain a leader for long. This creates a collision inside every human being, the longing for a world governed by virtue and the recognition that we live in a world governed by pressure. The moral self imagines consistency, stability, righteousness. The survival self operates in a landscape of shifting alliances, unpredictable forces, competing interests, and hidden motives. Machiavelli's brilliance lies in refusing to choose between these selves. He shows us that the survival self shapes the structure of society, while the moral self constructs the stories that justify it. Politics becomes a theater where ideals provide meaning, but power writes the script. Once we accept this, we begin to understand why illusions crumble so violently. We expect leaders to be moral heroes, but we punish them when they act with moral restraint. We demand honesty, yet reward those who craft strategic narratives. We claim to value fairness, yet gravitate instinctively toward strength. The contradiction is not hypocrisy. It is the duality of the human psyche. Machiavelli insists that facing this duality is not cynicism, but maturity. The alternative is to remain a child in a world built by adults who do not share our illusions. Effectual truth cuts deeply because it exposes how often morality becomes a luxury, not a compass. When resources shrink, when fear rises, when uncertainty spreads, the survival self takes command, and principles fade into background noise. The modern world, with its fragile economies and volatile political climates, is a landscape Machiavelli would recognize. A field where people oscillate between ideal aspiration and instinctual reaction. Leaders who misunderstand this oscillation fail. Societies that deny it become vulnerable to manipulation by those who understand it too well. But Machiavelli does not merely diagnose human nature. He reveals the cost of ignoring it. Societies collapse not because they lack virtue, but because they cling to illusions about themselves. Leaders fall not because they are evil, but because they misjudge the psychological structure of power. Individuals suffer not because they are immoral, but because they believe the world will reward their goodness without demanding resilience. Effectual truth demands that we align our expectations with the actual behavior of human beings, rather than the mythic version we prefer. This does not mean abandoning ideals. It means grounding them. It means building political structures that account for fear, desire, ambition, and unpredictability, rather than wishing them away. It means recognizing that the moral self becomes effective only when supported by strategies that respect the survival instincts of individuals and groups. Machiavelli's realism is not a rejection of hope, but an invitation to anchor hope in understanding rather than fantasy. His insight becomes most powerful when we examine our own internal contradictions. We wish to be generous, yet fear scarcity. We wish to be courageous, yet fear loss. We wish to be honest, yet fear exposure. These tensions govern our private decisions, just as they govern politics. Effectual truth does not blame us for these contradictions. It reveals them so we can navigate them. The world becomes clearer once we stop demanding purity from a species built on conflict between instinct and aspiration. To live with effectual truth is to develop a kind of psychological agility. It demands the ability to shift between idealism and realism without losing integrity. It asks us to recognize when morality guides action and when survival must intervene. It insists that we distinguish between the stories we tell about ourselves and the forces that actually shape our choices. And it challenges us to lead, act, and build with eyes open, not closed. The transition into this perspective is uncomfortable, but necessary. Once the illusion of moral dominance collapses, we begin to see the human creature, its full complexity. And only then do we understand how power truly operates. And as this understanding settles, another question begins to lift itself from beneath the surface, pulling us deeper into the psychological terrain Machiavelli mapped centuries ago. A terrain where humans reveal themselves not as moral abstractions, but as political animals, shaped by instinct before reason. The human being reveals its truth long before it speaks, long before it thinks, long before it constructs moral explanations to disguise its impulses. And Machiavelli forces us to confront this primordial truth without sentimentality. Man is a political animal before he is a moral individual. He acts from fear before he acts from principle. He moves from desire before he moves from conscience. He seeks belonging before he seeks virtue. To understand politics, one must understand these engines. To misunderstand them is to misunderstand humanity itself. This recognition is brutal because it strips away the stories we tell about our nobility. We imagine ourselves guided by values, but we are guided by pressures. We imagine our choices are rational, but they are sculpted by emotional forces that operate beneath awareness. Machiavelli saw this centuries before psychology emerged, long before the language of unconscious drives or evolutionary impulses existed. He saw the creature under the costume, and he dared to write what others refused to acknowledge. Political behavior is not an extension of ethics, but an orchestration of instincts. Fear is the first instinct he exposes, not metaphorical fear, but the visceral kind that shapes the architecture of human behavior. Fear of loss, fear of vulnerability, fear of chaos, fear of being forgotten or replaced. These fears do not merely influence political decisions, they generate them. A citizen supports authority not because authority is just, but because uncertainty terrifies them. A ruler consolidates power not because he is cruel, but because. Threats ignite his defensive instincts. Fear turns individuals into groups, groups into factions, factions into movements. It is the hidden pulse beneath every public narrative. Desire moves just as fiercely. The desire for power, status, recognition, security, dominance, survival. Desire makes people predictable and unpredictable at once. It fuels ambition, but also corrodes loyalty. It inspires creativity, but also intensifies conflict. To ignore desire is to misunderstand political life entirely. A society is not shaped by laws alone. It is shaped by the collective desires that surge beneath those laws. Machiavelli knew that desire cannot be disciplined by moral instruction. It can only be managed, redirected, or used, which is why he writes not for saints, but for rulers who must work with humans as they are, not as they pretend to be. Then comes the need for belonging, the most underestimated force in the political universe. Human beings do not simply seek community, they fear exclusion as deeply as they fear death. Exclusion shatters identity. It threatens survival. It creates enemies where none existed. This need for belonging drives conformity, loyalty, fanaticism, collective rage. It is the root of political tribes and ideological movements. People join causes not because those causes are true, but because those causes give them identity. Machiavelli would recognize instantly the dynamics of digital mobs in the world of 2025, where belonging is manufactured through screens and outrage becomes the currency of community. And beneath these instincts lies the need for control. Not absolute control, but enough control to feel that one's life is not determined by indifferent forces. Humans panic when control slips. They search for leaders who promise stability, even if that stability comes at the cost of freedom. They surrender autonomy when they cannot tolerate uncertainty. Control becomes psychological anesthetic. Authority becomes emotional refuge. Machiavelli understood this long before authoritarianism became a modern concept. People do not follow power because they are coerced. They follow power because power relieves the terror of unpredictability. These instincts reveal a truth that virtue cannot erase. Politics is not the space where humans transcend themselves. It is the space where humans expose themselves. The polite exterior collapses. The curated self dissolves. What remains is the collective nervous system of a species navigating threat, opportunity, and competition. Machiavelli watched the behavior of rulers, citizens, armies, and mobs, and he recognized the same patterns recurring endlessly. The moment the moral self hesitates, the survival self acts, and it acts with a clarity morality cannot match. The modern world, for all its sophistication, only intensifies these instincts. Technology magnifies desire. Information amplifies fear. Social media weaponizes belonging. Ideology industrializes identity. The political animal does not evolve into something higher. It evolves into something faster. Our emotions now move at the speed of networks. Our fears are fed by global crises transmitted instantly. Our desires are shaped by curated images of success. Our belonging is fragmenting into digital tribes that transcend borders. Machiavelli would not be shocked. He would say, "This is simply the human creature exposed by new tools." This exposure forces us to confront a psychological contradiction. We believe we are individuals making rational decisions, yet we behave as members of a collective organism driven by instinctual triggers. The survival self hijacks the moral self before the moral self can even speak. We justify our reactions afterward, crafting narratives to match impulses already chosen. In this way, political identity becomes emotional identity, disguised as conviction. We think we choose our beliefs, but our beliefs often choose us. Fear shapes ideology. Desire shapes ambition. Belonging shapes loyalty. Control shapes governance. These are not philosophical abstractions. They are psychological realities. And Machiavelli demands we study them with the seriousness we usually reserve for moral ideals. Because the human animal becomes dangerous when its instincts are ignored. A leader who misunderstands fear will provoke rebellion. A citizen who misunderstands desire will misjudge power. A society that misunderstands belonging will tear itself apart. Politics collapses not from immorality, but from psychological blindness. This is why Machiavelli's analysis remains alive. He does not simply analyze power. He analyzes the emotional logic of power. He reveals that no political system can function unless it channels fear, desire, belonging, and control into forms that produce stability rather than chaos. A ruler must understand the instincts of his people. A people must understand the instincts of their rulers. Without this mutual understanding, trust cannot form. And without trust, governance becomes coercion, rebellion becomes inevitable, and societies enter cycles of fragmentation and consolidation. The tragic irony is that humans long for harmony but generate conflict. They desire freedom but crave control. They seek equality but pursue advantage. They preach morality but practice survival. This contradiction is not hypocrisy. It is the dual structure of human nature. Machiavelli does not judge it. He observes it. And he gives us the tools to understand why politics becomes volatile the moment these instincts collide. Consider fear in times of crisis. Rationality evaporates. People turn to whoever promises protection. They demand decisive action, even when that action reduces liberty. They obey not because they trust, but because they fear. Desire then enters, reshaping the crisis into opportunity for those who know how to wield it. Belonging tightens, dividing citizens into loyalists and traitors. Control solidifies in the hands of the one who appears strongest. This cycle has been repeated in ancient republics, medieval kingdoms, modern democracies, and digital societies. The tools change, but the animal does not. To understand this animal is to understand why moral appeals often fail. They speak to the wrong self. They address the conscious mind, while the unconscious drives the action. They assume humans behave according to principles, when humans behave according to pressures. This is why political persuasion rarely succeeds through argument. It succeeds through emotional alignment. Machiavelli's realism is not cynicism. It is psychological literacy. He teaches us to look beneath rhetoric, beneath ideology, beneath image, and find the instinctual forces that move the collective body. Once we see these forces, the veil drops. We understand why democracies fracture. We understand why authoritarian leaders rise. We understand why populations shift from hope to anger to desperation. We understand why people betray their ideals under pressure. And we understand why any political system, regardless of its moral sophistication, can collapse when it fails to manage instinct. This knowledge does not offer comfort. It demands responsibility. If humans are political animals before moral individuals, then the task is not to deny instinct, but to govern it, to create systems that channel fear into vigilance rather than paranoia, to redirect desire toward contribution rather than domination, to cultivate belonging without sacrificing individuality, to provide control without extinguishing freedom. These goals require a realism that does not flinch from human nature. And once this realism settles into our understanding, another question rises with heavy inevitability. If the political animal is driven by instinct rather than virtue, then what kind of leader does such a creature require? And what qualities allow a leader not merely to survive, but to shape the turbulent world this creature creates. And once this realism settles into our understanding, another question rises with heavy inevitability. If the political animal is driven by instinct rather than virtue, then what kind of leader does such a creature require? And what qualities allow a leader not merely to survive, but to shape the turbulent world this creature creates? Machiavelli answers with a cold steadiness that strips away every romantic impulse we attach to leadership. Leadership, as he sees it, is not the art of moral inspiration, but the discipline of mastering human volatility. A leader is not a prophet of ideals, but an architect of stability constructed from unstable materials. His first revelation is simple yet devastating. A leader must understand the dual nature of human beings more deeply than they understand it themselves. This is the foundation of power. A ruler who misunderstands fear will miscalculate loyalty. A ruler who misunderstands desire will misjudge ambition. A ruler who misunderstands the belonging will fail to bind people together. A ruler who misunderstands insecurity will lose control of the very structures meant to secure authority. Leadership begins not with strategy, but with psychological literacy. Ignorance of human nature is the most fatal weakness a leader can possess. But Machiavelli does not stop at observation. He moves toward an even harsher truth. A successful leader must possess the capacity to act against conventional morality when necessity demands it. Not because cruelty is admirable, but because power operates in a landscape where moral rules collide with survival imperatives. The leader must be prepared to use fear when love collapses, deception when transparency fails, decisiveness when deliberation threatens authority. This is not advocacy for evil. It is recognition of reality. A leader who refuses to act harshly at the right moment condemns not only himself, but also the people who depend on him. The moral self may recoil from this. The survival self does not. A leader who cannot harness both selves is doomed. Machiavelli does not demand that leaders be cruel. He demands that they not be naive about the conditions in which they operate. The world does not reward purity. The world rewards those who can navigate pressure without collapsing. The leader must therefore cultivate a flexibility that morality alone cannot provide. He must know when to uphold principle and when to break it, when to show mercy and when mercy becomes the mask of weakness. This duality reveals Machiavelli's most controversial point. Virtue, as conventionally understood, is insufficient for leadership. Not because virtue is worthless, but because virtue detached from effectual truth becomes dangerous. A ruler who insists on absolute goodness in a world that does not reciprocate will be destroyed by those more willing to embrace necessity. A leader who presents himself as harmless in a realm governed by ambition invites predators. A leader who attempts to govern through pure benevolence misunderstands the emotional machinery of the political organism. Yet, Machiavelli does not dismiss virtue entirely. He reframes it. Virtue becomes not moral purity, but the capacity for strength, intelligence, adaptability, and strategic courage. Virtue becomes effectiveness. It becomes the ability to shape events rather than be shaped by them. It becomes the internal force that keeps a leader from being enslaved by circumstance. The leader must possess what Machiavelli calls virtù in order to tame the unpredictability of fortune. Without this energy, power slips away and chaos fills the vacuum. But even virtù is not enough. Machiavelli introduces another brutal element. The leader must learn to navigate fortune, the chaotic force that governs outcomes beyond human intention. Leaders who depend solely on planning collapse when reality shifts. Leaders who depend solely on instinct collapse when pressure requires structure. The leader must therefore remain fluid, capable of shifting tactics as swiftly as conditions change. Rigidity is death. Adaptability is salvation. And the leader who clings to a singular method of ruling will eventually be undone by the very method he worships. Fortune punishes those who cannot pivot. It rewards those who recognize when the world has changed and alter themselves accordingly. This is why Machiavelli views leadership as a perpetual confrontation with uncertainty. The leader must live on alert, not paranoid, but awake, reading the emotional winds of the populace and the shifting landscapes of power. He must sense danger before it materializes, betrayal before it reveals itself, opportunity before others perceive it. Leadership in Machiavelli's world is not a position, it is a psychological state. This psychological demand becomes even more complex in the world of 2025. Leaders now operate within accelerated conditions where information mutates rapidly, publics transform overnight, and the emotional climate shifts with every new crisis. The leader must not only understand instinct, he must understand the digital amplification of instinct. Fear spreads faster, desires multiply, outrage circulates instantaneously. Belonging fragments into microgroups. Authority is both more fragile and more scrutinized. Machiavelli's leader must now navigate not only human nature, but human nature enhanced, distorted, and magnified by technology. But the essential principle remains unchanged. A leader survives only by understanding the nature of those he leads and the nature of the world that shapes them. And this leads to Machiavelli's sharpest insight into leadership. The leader must not rely on the goodwill of others to maintain power. Goodwill is fleeting. Loyalty is conditional. Admiration dissolves under pressure. A leader must instead construct systems that stabilize power even when public sentiment wavers. He must build alliances, manage factions, anticipate threats, enforce boundaries, and project strength. Power without structure is illusion. Strength without strategy is temporary. This does not mean a leader must rule through fear alone. It means he must know how to balance fear and trust, distance and familiarity, generosity and severity. The leader must appear moral without being constrained by morality, appear compassionate without being ruled by compassion, appear trustworthy while maintaining strategic opacity. Machiavelli does not call for hypocrisy. He calls for mastery of perception. A leader must understand that people respond not to truth itself, but to the image of truth. Politics operates in this space between appearance and reality. The leader who ignores appearance dies. The leader who relies only on appearance collapses when tested. The leader must control both. This tension between reality and appearance introduces another of Machiavelli's essential warnings. A leader must never appear weak. Weakness invites insurgency. Weakness reveals vulnerability. Weakness awakens the predatory instincts of rivals. The political animal respects strength, even if it pretends to value kindness. Machiavelli understood that humans admire virtue, but follow power. They praise goodness, but obey force. They celebrate ideals, but respond to outcomes. The leader must therefore project an image of confidence even when internally he wrestles with uncertainty. To reveal fear is to feed it. Yet this projection must not slip into arrogance. Arrogance blinds. Arrogance alienates. Arrogance transforms allies into enemies. The leader must cultivate a disciplined humility, a private recognition of vulnerability paired with a public demonstration of controlled authority. This is not duplicity. It is psychological intelligence. It is the ability to maintain inner flexibility while sustaining outer stability. Once we understand the demands Machiavelli places on the leader, the concept of leadership becomes less romantic and more elemental. It becomes not a calling but a burden, not a privilege but a responsibility, not a display of virtue but an exercise in clarity. To lead is to stand in constant tension between instinct and strategy, image and action, morality and necessity, fortune and intention. It requires a kind of internal durability that few possess and even fewer can sustain. The tragic dimension of Machiavelli's leader emerges here. The leader must operate at a level of self-awareness that isolates him from the very people he governs. He must understand their emotions without being governed by them, anticipate their shifts without revealing his own, protect them while recognizing that their loyalty is conditional. Leadership becomes a form of existential solitude, a psychological battlefield where the leader must negotiate with forces both internal and external, both personal and collective. But beyond this solitude, another question gathers strength. If leadership demands such mastery of human instinct, then what specific qualities allow a ruler not only to survive, but to dominate the unpredictable arena in which he operates? And how does he wield these qualities without losing himself in the very forces he seeks to control? And if leadership demands mastery of instinct, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What qualities allow a ruler not only to endure the violent unpredictability of political life, but to bend it, shape it, and remake it through sheer force of will? Machiavelli answers not with abstractions, but with a psychological anatomy of power. He describes not a saint, not a philosopher king, but a creature forged in the furnace of human volatility, a figure who embodies the sharpness of necessity rather than the softness of idealism. This figure possesses virtù, a concept so often misunderstood because it refuses to fit within moral categories. Virtù is not goodness. Virtù is not righteousness. Virtù is the capacity to act effectively in a world governed by conflict, ambition, instability, and human desire. To understand virtue, one must strip away the illusions that surround leadership. We imagine that leaders succeed because they possess talent or charisma or noble character. But Machiavelli insists that these are insufficient. Virtue begins with clarity, the kind of clarity that sees human nature without distortion. A leader must look at people not as they should be, but as they are: fickle, fearful, hopeful, ambitious, envious, longing for belonging, yet quick to betray when personal interest shifts. This clarity is not cynicism. It is the grounding upon which all effective action must rest. A leader who mistakes dreams for reality will be swallowed by those who do not make the same mistake. But clarity alone does not create virtue. Virtue requires the courage to act decisively when others hesitate. It demands the ability to cut through uncertainty before uncertainty freezes the political body. The leader must cultivate the discipline, choose the harsh path when the soft path invites collapse. He must sense when delay becomes danger and when force becomes necessity. Machiavelli understands that the world punishes hesitation more ruthlessly than error. People forgive those who act. They devour those who falter. The leader must therefore treat decision itself as a weapon, a tool that shapes both perception and reality. This decisiveness, however, must not be confused with recklessness. Virtue is not impulse, but strategic courage. It is the ability to assess a situation with precision, see the moving parts, feel the emotional currents beneath them, and strike in a way that alters the trajectory of events. A leader must know when to appear ruthless and when to appear generous, when to be visible and when to vanish into strategic silence. He must wield contradiction as an instrument. He must embody the paradox that strength must sometimes present itself softly and mercy must sometimes harden into severity. Machiavelli shows that virtue also demands flexibility. The leader must be able to shift methods with the shifting winds of fortune. The fox must replace the lion, and the lion must return when cunning alone cannot protect authority. A rigid leader dies quickly. A flexible leader survives storms, betrayals, crises, and the unpredictability of human emotion. Fortune favors not the strong, but the adaptable, and virtue is the art of adapting without losing the core of one's power. It is the capacity to reinvent one's strategy before the world forces reinvention upon them. Yet adaptability alone cannot sustain power. The leader must cultivate discipline, not the shallow discipline of external order, but the deep internal discipline that allows him to regulate his own impulses. Anger must not govern action. Pride must not blind judgment. Fear must not paralyze movement. Desire must not distort perception. The leader must be able to suppress certain instincts for the sake of others. He must be able to restrain emotion long enough to see clearly, to calculate, to position himself. This internal mastery distinguishes the powerful from the doomed. Many rulers fall not because of external enemies, but because they cannot manage the enemy inside themselves. Virtue also requires the strategic use of appearance. The leader must craft an image that aligns with the needs of the moment. He must appear compassionate when compassion strengthens loyalty. He must appear harsh when harshness restores order. He must appear stable even when privately he confronts turmoil. Machiavelli does not see this as deception, but as political intelligence. The masses respond to symbols more than substance, to appearance more than truth. To ignore this is not moral purity, it is incompetence. A leader who refuses to shape perception surrenders perception to his enemies. But Machiavelli's most controversial claim about virtue lies in its relationship to cruelty. He argues that cruelty, when used correctly, can secure stability. The leader must not be afraid to act with severity when severity prevents greater suffering. A swift, calculated cruelty is often more humane than prolonged chaos. The moral self recoils from this argument, but Machiavelli demands we understand the world as it is. A leader who hesitates to use force when necessary will face a greater force later, one unleashed by the very weakness he displayed. Cruelty is not virtue, but under certain conditions, it becomes an instrument of survival. This does not mean the leader should embrace violence. It means he should master it, regulate it, and use it with discipline. Violence without control destroys authority. Violence without justification destroys legitimacy. Virtue demands knowing when force stabilizes and when it destabilizes. The leader must act like a surgeon, cutting only to save the body, not indulging in brutality for its own sake. Machiavelli's realism has no patience for cruelty motivated by ego. True virtue is the ruthless protection of necessary order, not the celebration of domination. Another component of virtue is foresight. The leader must anticipate danger before others perceive it. He must guard against potential threats rather than wait for them to become present disasters. Machiavelli compares this to the discipline of doctors who treat illnesses before symptoms become visible. A leader without foresight becomes a prisoner of circumstances. A leader with foresight becomes the architect of events. This foresight is not prophecy. It is the disciplined interpretation of human behavior, the understanding that patterns of ambition, fear, envy, and loyalty repeat themselves across time. Virtue also demands the ability to manage allegiance. Loyalty is never pure. It is conditional, fragile, negotiable. People follow leaders who provide stability, opportunity, and psychological refuge. When these conditions break, loyalty breaks. A leader must therefore cultivate alliances with care, balancing fear and trust, advantage and loyalty. He must ensure that his supporters benefit from his success, while also reminding them subtly of the consequences of betrayal. Machiavelli's realism strips away idealism about friendship in politics. Friendship is useful, but not sacred. Alliances are strategic, not spiritual. Leaders who treat personal bonds as moral guarantees fall to those who treat them as political tools. In the world of 2025, these dynamics intensify. Leaders must navigate not only traditional factions, but digital publics, fragmented tribes, algorithmic illusions, and globalized emotional currents. Perception shifts rapidly. Outrage rises unpredictably. Attention becomes a weapon, and silence becomes a strategy. A leader without virtue will drown in the noise. A leader with virtue will shape it, turning public volatility into an instrument rather than a threat. Machiavelli's teachings become even more relevant, not less. The political organism has become more complicated, but its instincts remain ancient. Yet the possession of virtue does not guarantee permanence. Fortune still intervenes. Circumstances shift beyond calculation. Rivals emerge unexpectedly. Public sentiment mutates. The world defies mastery. Virtue is the discipline that limits vulnerability, not the magic that eliminates it. The leader must therefore remain vigilant, fluid, adaptive, and psychologically anchored. He must understand that power is always temporary, always conditional, always at risk. This recognition does not weaken a leader, it strengthens him. It keeps his mind sharp and his instincts awake. But beneath all these qualities, one principle binds Machiavelli's view of leadership. The leader must be willing to bear the moral weight that others cannot. He must take actions that the public benefits from, but does not wish to witness. He must make decisions that preserve stability while staining his own reputation. He must protect people from dangers they barely understand, while allowing them to judge him harshly for the methods he uses. Leadership, in this view, is a sacrificial role. The leader becomes the container of necessary darkness so that others can live in relative light. This recognition generates the tragic arc in Machiavelli's philosophy. To lead well is to inhabit a space that no ordinary person could withstand. It is to stand at the intersection of morality and necessity, instinct and strategy, chaos and order, public perception and private burden. It is to understand that judgment will be harsh even when actions were necessary, and that legacy will always be contested. Leadership becomes not a reward, but a cost, a psychological responsibility so heavy that only those with virtue can bear it without breaking. And yet, after Machiavelli reveals the anatomy of virtue, he forces us to ask a deeper question. Can any leader truly succeed without understanding how fortune opposes or cooperates with virtue, and what happens when even? The strongest mind must confront the unpredictable force that governs outcomes beyond intention. And yet, after Machiavelli reveals the anatomy of virtue, he forces us to face a truth even more destabilizing. No matter how disciplined, how strategic, how adaptable a leader becomes, he is never sovereign over the world. Fortune stands above him like a shadow that cannot be banished, a force that obeys no logic, no morality, no preparation. Machiavelli strips away the fantasy that mastery alone secures power. He tells us bluntly that the world does not reward virtue or vice. It rewards alignment with the shifting winds of circumstance. A leader may possess virtue in its purest form, yet fall simply because the world changed faster than he could. This truth is not a resignation. It is a demand for deeper clarity. Machiavelli insists that fortune governs half of human action, leaving the other half to virtue. This proportion shocks the modern mind, trained to believe in absolute self-determination, trained to worship effort, discipline, and willpower as the architects of all achievement. But Machiavelli pierces this illusion. Human beings act within constraints they did not choose, within structures they cannot control, within a world that moves with or without their permission. Fortune is the reminder that we are not the center of the universe. But fortune is not simple randomness. For Machiavelli, fortune is the movement of external conditions, shifts in alliances, emergence of rivals, changes in public sentiment, unexpected crises, catastrophic events, opportunities disguised as disruptions. The leader must understand fortune not as a mystical force, but as the unpredictable landscape upon which virtue must operate. And in this landscape, rigidity becomes fatal. A leader who cannot adapt to fortune becomes its victim. This raises the central tension of Machiavelli's philosophy, the conflict between virtue and fortune. Virtue is human force. Fortune is external. More likely to bend fortune to his will. The timid leader waits for perfect conditions. The bold leader creates conditions. Fortune respects the courage to act before clarity appears. It bends toward those who seize rather than those who hesitate. But here lies the paradox. Excessive boldness becomes recklessness. Excessive caution becomes paralysis. Virtue requires the ability to judge which posture fortune demands in each moment. A leader who clings to boldness when flexibility is needed will fall. A leader who retreats into caution when aggression is required will fall. Virtue is not a static quality. It is a shifting equilibrium of strategic instinct and disciplined restraint. The leader must reinvent himself in response to fortune, not as a coward fleeing identity, but as a strategist shaping identity to survive. The modern world intensifies this paradox. In the era of 2025, fortune shifts not in decades, but in days. Markets collapse overnight. Public opinion mutates within hours. Digital storms reshape reputations instantly. Alliances transform without warning. The river of fortune has become faster, deeper, and more destructive. Leaders who learn to govern through slow deliberation cannot endure its pace. Machiavelli's demand for adaptability becomes even more merciless. A leader must reorient himself before the world forces him to. In this age, virtue is measured not by strength alone, but by velocity of perception. This brings Machiavelli to another brutal insight. Fortune exposes the limits of a leader's nature. A leader who thrives in times of peace may collapse in times of war. A leader who excels in crisis may fail in stability. A leader whose virtue fits one historical moment may become irrelevant in the next. Human nature resists transformation, but fortune demands it. When the world changes, the leader must violate his own inclinations to survive. If he cannot, fortune will break him. This insight reveals a deeper tragedy. Leaders do not fall because they lack virtue. They fall because their virtue is mismatched to fortune's demands. A bold leader in a cautious world becomes a tyrant. A cautious leader in a turbulent world becomes a victim. A generous leader in a ruthless world becomes prey. A ruthless leader in a stable world becomes a destabilizer. Virtue must be calibrated to the era, not to the leader's preference. Fortune is indifferent to personal temperament. This mismatch explains the rise and collapse of countless rulers across history. It explains why some leaders seem brilliant until conditions shift and reveal their rigidity. It explains why others, underestimated for years, suddenly rise when circumstances require their specific strengths. Fortune reveals the hidden architecture of leadership, the part of power that cannot be controlled, only navigated. Machiavelli does not tell the leader to conquer fortune. He tells him to understand the terrain she creates. But how does one navigate a force that is by definition unpredictable? Machiavelli offers a subtle answer through preparation, through the cultivation of internal resilience, through the building of structures that absorb volatility. A leader cannot stop misfortune, but he can reduce its destructiveness. He can anticipate betrayal by diversifying alliances. He can mitigate crisis by strengthening institutions. He can reduce public instability by managing fear and expectation. Fortune strikes hardest where foundations are weak. Yet, even with preparation, fortune remains sovereign. The leader must therefore cultivate an emotional relationship with fortune, neither arrogance nor despair, neither entitlement nor resignation. He must approach fortune with pragmatic humility. He must know that success is never entirely earned and failure never entirely deserved. This humility protects the leader from the intoxication of triumph and the paralysis of defeat. Fortune gives and takes with equal indifference. Virtue becomes the discipline of acting without the guarantee of reward. This emotional posture reshapes the inner life of the leader. He no longer interprets success as a sign of personal greatness, but as a temporary alignment between his actions and external conditions. He no longer interprets failure as personal inadequacy, but as a misalignment between his nature and the moment. This does not absolve him of responsibility. It clarifies it. He cannot control fortune, but he must be accountable for how he responds to her. Responsibility becomes the acceptance of partial control in a world that tempts us with fantasies of total control. This recognition produces the deepest philosophical tension in Machiavelli's thought. The leader must act as though his actions determine everything, while knowing that much lies beyond his reach. He must behave with the confidence of a master, while thinking with the humility of a servant. He must project certainty while privately acknowledging uncertainty. This dual consciousness is not hypocrisy, it is necessity. Without external confidence, the people lose faith. Without internal humility, the leader loses judgment. Machiavelli's treatment of fortune also exposes the limits of human agency more broadly. The political animal, driven by instinct, desires control. It longs to believe that its fate rests in its own hands. But fortune reminds the individual that existence is shared with forces that transcend personal will. This truth does not diminish humanity. It embeds humanity within a larger movement. Leaders and citizens alike confront the same existential condition. The world is not designed to accommodate our desires. And yet, paradoxically, Machiavelli reveals that this confrontation with fortune is what gives meaning to virtue. If fortune were entirely predictable, virtue would become mechanical. If fortune were entirely dominant, virtue would become futile. It is the tension between unpredictability and agency that creates the space for leadership, judgment, action, and identity. Virtue exists because fortune resists. Power exists because the world does not bend easily. This insight prepares us for a more disturbing question that begins to form quietly under Machiavelli's analysis. If fortune shapes outcomes beyond human intention, and virtue is the disciplined force that navigates chaos, then what of the people themselves? How does the unpredictable, instinct-driven mass respond to the collisions between virtue and fortune? And what happens when their emotions become the decisive force in the rise or fall of rulers? A question that pulls us inevitably toward the next movement in Machiavelli's philosophy, where the ruler is no longer the only one under examination, and the people themselves become the volatile element that no amount of virtue can ignore. A question that pulls us inevitably toward the next movement in Machiavelli's philosophy, where the ruler is no longer the only one under examination, and the people themselves become the volatile element that no amount of virtue can ignore. For Machiavelli understood something most thinkers prefer to avoid. The crowd is both the foundation and the threat, the source of a ruler's legitimacy and the abyss that can swallow him without warning. To rule is to navigate not merely individuals, but a collective organism whose moods shift faster than reason can track, whose instincts awaken in unpredictable waves, and whose hunger for security and recognition makes it both cooperative and combustible. He begins by exposing a brutal truth. The people desire only not to be oppressed, while the great desire to oppress. This does not mean the masses are noble. It means they are vulnerable. And vulnerability generates fear, resentment, longing, volatility. The people may appear passive, but Machiavelli warns that their silence is not endorsement. It is the quiet of latent force. The political animal becomes most dangerous when it feels powerlessness, because powerlessness accumulates pressure. The ruler who mistakes quiet for submission is preparing the stage for his own destruction. Yet Machiavelli does not romanticize the people. He recognizes that they act not from philosophical clarity, but from immediate emotional stimuli. They shift direction quickly. They adore leaders who flatter hope and abandon leaders who require sacrifice. They are generous with praise and ruthless with blame. They forget easily and erupt suddenly. To govern such a body requires a leader who understands the psychology of crowds with the same precision he uses to understand the psychology of individuals. The crowd is not a rational actor, but an instinctive one. It moves according to fear, desire, belonging, and the need to believe in a protective figure. Fear remains the dominant driver. When the people fear external threat, they seek unity. When they fear internal betrayal, they turn against their leaders. When fear becomes collective, it becomes political dynamite. Machiavelli knew this long before modern mass movements emerged. He understood that a frightened population grants extraordinary power to whoever promises stability and withdraws that power the moment the promise collapses. Fear does not produce loyalty, it produces dependency. And dependency is unstable because it turns quickly into blame. Desire also shapes the crowd. Not desire for power, but desire for dignity, fairness, opportunity, recognition. When these desires are met, the people support authority. When they are denied, resentment grows. And resentment is the emotion Machiavelli feared most, because it transforms ordinary citizens into political agents. A resentful population does not simply withdraw loyalty, it seeks retribution. It becomes capable of violence, manipulation, false hope, and allegiance to any figure who promises to reverse its humiliation. Desire unmet becomes a political weapon. Belonging plays another decisive role. People want to feel part of a collective identity, and leaders who understand this can build powerful bonds. But belonging also creates factions, divisions, rivalries. The same instinct that unites citizens under one banner can divide them into warring camps. Machiavelli observed this in the republics of his time. But in the era of 2025, belonging fractures even faster, splintering into digital tribes, ideological clusters, and algorithmically curated identities. The crowd no longer moves as one. It moves as many competing emotional ecosystems. A leader cannot govern this complexity through force alone. He must shape identity, channel belonging into stability rather than fragmentation. And beneath all of this lies the people's perception of the leader. Appearance becomes psychological oxygen. The people must believe their ruler is strong, competent, steady, capable of protecting them. They do not require moral perfection, but they require the image of capability. A leader who appears hesitant or broken invites collective anxiety. Anxiety spreads faster than rebellion and corrodes authority from within. Machiavelli understood that a leader's downfall often begins not with an external attack, but with a shift in the people's emotional confidence. When they doubt him, his power dissolves before any formal challenge occurs. This is why Machiavelli insists that a ruler must avoid being hated above all else. Hatred blinds. Hatred unifies factions that would otherwise oppose one another. Hatred transforms grievances into purpose. And once hatred crystallizes, no amount of virtue can undo it. Cruelty used strategically can secure order, but cruelty used excessively, unnecessarily, or publicly awakens the deepest instinct of the people, the instinct to topple the one who humiliates them. Hatred is not a political sentiment. It is a psychological revolt. But the opposite danger also exists, becoming too loved. Excessive affection breeds entitlement. Entitlement breeds disappointment. Disappointment breeds betrayal. The people love a leader when he meets their desires, but love dissolves under scarcity, fear, or perceived injustice. Machiavelli argues that it is safer to be feared than loved, but he does not exalt fear. He warns that fear must be controlled, contained, disciplined, never allowed to turn into hatred. A leader must balance respect and distance, closeness and authority. Love alone cannot sustain power. Fear alone cannot sustain power. The equilibrium between them is fragile, shifting, alive. The world of 2025 magnifies this fragility. The people no longer experience leadership through direct experience, but through mediated images, narratives, fragments of information, emotional waves spreading through digital channels. Leaders are no longer judged by deeds alone, but by perception, interpretation, and public mood. A single misstep becomes amplified. A single rumor becomes truth. A single shift in narrative transforms admiration into contempt. Machiavelli's warnings become prophetic. The crowd's perception is both the foundation and the threat. This leads to an even more unsettling truth. The people do not always know what they want. They oscillate between freedom and control, between bold leadership and gentle leadership, between harsh justice and compassionate justice. They demand protection, yet resent authority, demand opportunity, yet resist sacrifice, demand stability, yet pursue emotional chaos. The ruler must navigate these contradictions with precision. He must understand that the people's desires are not coherent principles, but waves of emotion that crash unpredictably. To govern them, he must read their anxieties, interpret their desires, and anticipate their shifts. But Machiavelli also acknowledges that the people possess a certain wisdom. They may be inconsistent, emotional, fickle, yet they know when they are mistreated. They know when their dignity is violated. They know when corruption becomes unbearable. They know when weakness threatens their safety. While they cannot articulate complex political theory, they can feel injustice, and feeling becomes action. This is why Machiavelli believes that ruling against the wishes of the people is possible only temporarily. Sooner or later, instinct triumphs over structure, and the ruler is forced to reckon with the very forces he attempted to ignore. This insight pulls Machiavelli into the psychology of collective behavior. The people act as a singular emotional body, responding to symbolic gestures rather than rational arguments. They react to strength, ritual, narrative, myth. A leader must understand the symbolic dimensions of power, ceremonies, public displays, decisive gestures, visible achievements. These symbols speak to the people's unconscious mind, calming fear, igniting loyalty, framing the leader as an anchor in a turbulent world. Without symbolic authority, formal authority weakens. Yet symbols alone cannot protect a leader. They must align with action. Hypocrisy becomes lethal when discovered. The people forgive failure, but not betrayal. They forgive harshness, but not humiliation. They forgive uncertainty, but not incompetence. Machiavelli understood that the leader must embody coherence between the image he projects and the actions he performs. If these diverge too sharply, the psychological contract between ruler and ruled collapses. As Machiavelli examines this dynamic, he uncovers a final, deeper truth. The leader's relationship to the people is not built on shared virtue, but on mutual necessity. The leader needs the people for legitimacy. The people need the leader for stability. This reciprocity is fragile because each side interprets necessity differently. The leader views stability as control. The people view stability as dignity. The leader seeks obedience. The people seek protection. These forces collide continually, shaping the rise and fall of political systems. The tragic edge of Machiavelli's insight emerges here. The ruler may understand virtue perfectly. He may adapt flawlessly to fortune. Yet he can still be overthrown by the unpredictable emotional storm of the people. The crowd can elevate a leader beyond his capabilities and destroy him before he understands what has shifted. Public sentiment is the most volatile element of political life because it does not operate through logic. It operates through psychological contagion. When fear spreads, the people flee. When outrage spreads, they revolt. When hope spreads, they unite. The leader's task is not to control these emotions, but to channel them. And as this realization settles, another question sharpens beneath the surface. If the crowd can elevate or destroy rulers, and if rulers depend on symbolic and emotional authority to secure their position, then how does a leader design an image and narrative strong enough to withstand the turbulence of public instinct without becoming enslaved by the very illusion he creates? A question that unfolds directly into Machiavelli's next revelation, where the battle for power moves from the physical realm into the realm of perception itself. And if the battle for power moves from the physical realm into the realm of perception, then the leader must confront the most treacherous terrain Machiavelli ever described, the art of appearances. For in politics, reality is never encountered directly. It arrives filtered through emotion, rumor, narrative, and the symbolic gestures that shape collective imagination. A leader does not rule bodies alone, he rules minds. And minds respond not to truth, but to the truth they can bear. Machiavelli understood this with a clarity that feels almost violent. He tells us that men judge more by their eyes than their hands, because everyone sees, but few touch. Appearance becomes the decisive force because perception spreads faster than evidence, and narrative controls emotional instinct long before reality catches up. The leader who fails to shape his appearance becomes a prisoner of the interpretations others construct for him. Power leaks from him, not through defeat, but through misperception. This is why Machiavelli insists that a ruler must appear merciful, faithful, humane, upright, and religious. Not necessarily be these things, but appear so. The moral self recoils at this demand, but the survival self recognizes its necessity. People follow what they see. They do not investigate the depth of character. They respond to the image that quiets their fears and flatters their hopes. A leader's appearance becomes a psychological mirror in which the people project their longing for stability. If he reflects this longing effectively, he secures their trust. If he reflects uncertainty, he awakens their doubt. But Machiavelli does not advise theatrical deception. He warns against the trap of becoming the mask one wears. A leader must use appearance strategically, not surrender identity to it. The mask must be a tool, not a prison. To perform virtue is not hypocrisy. It is political necessity. But to believe one's own performance is fatal. Leaders collapse not when they deceive others, but when they deceive themselves. This distinction is critical because the people do not observe contradictions with reason. They sense them. They feel the dissonance between image and action. Machiavelli knew that the crowd forgives cruelty when cruelty protects them. but they do not forgive inconsistency. Inconsistency signals weakness. Weakness signals vulnerability. Vulnerability signals opportunity for rivals. A leader must therefore cultivate coherence between public image and the emotional atmosphere he creates, even when the content of that image shifts with circumstance. The world of 2025 intensifies this pressure. The leader is no longer a distant figure seen through rituals and ceremonies. He is an omnipresent image, a face circulating through screens, a voice in every device, a narrative shaped by millions of interpretations. In such a world, appearance becomes both weapon and battlefield. Every gesture becomes symbolic. Every silence becomes meaningful. Every misstep becomes magnified. The leader must navigate not simply the perceptions of the moment, but the endless echo of those perceptions across digital landscapes. This produces a new kind of psychological burden. The leader must maintain visibility without overexposure, strength without rigidity, compassion without softness, authenticity without vulnerability. He must project steadiness in an unstable world and conviction in a fragmented one. Symbolic leadership becomes as important as practical governance. Actions matter, but interpretations matter more. Machiavelli would recognize this evolution instantly. He would call it nothing new, merely the intensification of human instinct through new tools. Yet he would also issue a warning. The more a leader depends on image, the more he risks being consumed by it. When appearance becomes the core of authority, the leader becomes trapped in an endless cycle of performance. He must constantly renew perception, constantly reinforce narrative, constantly defend symbolic territory. This exhausts virtue, drains clarity, and creates a psychological distance between the leader and reality. Leaders who live inside their own image lose the ability to read fortune accurately. They react to shadows rather than events. This is why Machiavelli insists that a leader must never rely on appearance alone. Appearance must be weapon, not foundation. Beneath it, the leader must possess real strength, strategic intelligence, and the courage to act decisively. The image protects authority. The action sustains it. If one collapses, the other follows. Appearances without action become farce. Action without appearances becomes invisible. The leader must walk a narrow line between visibility, substance, myth, and machinery. This duality creates a deeper psychological demand. The leader must be two selves at once, a public self that embodies stability, dignity, and symbolic reassurance, and a private self capable of brutality, calculation, and adaptation. These selves must never merge. If the public self learns too much from the private, it becomes monstrous. If the private self learns too much from the public, it becomes fragile. Leadership requires an internal partition, a controlled fragmentation of identity. The ruler must not collapse into the unity that ordinary individuals seek. His integrity lies in separation, not fusion. This fragmentation is not psychological dysfunction. It is the internal architecture of power. Machiavelli does not hide this. He exposes it with the same cold clarity he applies to all human behavior. A leader who attempts to be whole, transparent, or purely authentic destroys the distance that makes authority possible. The people do not want to see the human being entirely. They want to see the part of him that stabilizes their own chaos. His internal conflict must remain hidden, not to deceive them, but to protect them from a truth they are not equipped to bear. Yet, even this mastery of appearance cannot guarantee loyalty. The people admire the strong, but turn on the exposed. They praise virtue, but follow power. They adore leaders who offer hope, but abandon those who reveal weakness. A ruler must therefore maintain the delicate illusion that he is both accessible and untouchable, familiar yet formidable, human yet beyond ordinary limitations. Too much proximity invites disappointment. Too much distance invites resentment. Machiavelli's warnings are psychological before they are political. And behind all these insights, another question gathers force. If a leader must construct an image strong enough to command the people, and if this image must be maintained through constant vigilance, then how does he defend this? Symbolic authority against rivals whose ambitions sharpen in the shadows, waiting for even the smallest fracture in perception. A question that draws us directly into Machiavelli's next revelation, where the enemy emerges not only from outside, but from within the structures that surround the ruler, carrying dangers far more intimate and unpredictable. And if the enemy emerges not only from outside, but from within the structures that surround the ruler, then Machiavelli's warning sharpens into something darker. Power is never threatened most by distant rivals, but by those closest to its center. The court, the ministers, the advisors, the factions that orbit the throne like unstable planets, each driven by its own hunger, its own fear, its own private calculus of ambition. Here, loyalty becomes performance, obedience becomes strategy, and intimacy becomes potential betrayal. The ruler stands not at the top of a stable hierarchy, but in the middle of a shifting field of competing desires. Machiavelli reveals the brutal truth behind this arrangement. Those who serve the ruler do not desire his success, they desire their own. Their devotion lasts only as long as devotion benefits them. Their praise conceals utility. Their silence conceals calculation. A ruler who forgets this is already doomed. For the ambitions of ministers do not rise openly. They gather in shadows, whispered through alliances, tested through small disobediences, disguised as concern, loyalty, or moral critique. And once these ambitions grow stronger than fear, the ruler faces an enemy far more dangerous than any external force. This is why Machiavelli insists that a ruler must choose ministers carefully, not based on affection or shared ideals, but on competence and controlled ambition. A minister who owes everything to the ruler remains dependent. A minister who owes nothing becomes a threat. The ruler must surround himself with those whose fortunes rise with his own. Dependency is not just a political structure. It is a psychological tether. Without it, proximity becomes peril. But even dependency cannot eliminate danger entirely. Ambition can awaken in any man once he tastes influence, and influence is the most intoxicating substance in the political world. It distorts loyalty. It amplifies ego. It creates private kingdoms within the public kingdom. Machiavelli saw this repeatedly in the courts of his time. Servants who became masters in everything but name. Advisors whose whispers held more power than decrees. Generals whose armies drifted toward personal allegiance rather than institutional loyalty. For the ruler, these quiet shifts often signaled collapse far more decisively than open rebellion. To survive this environment, the ruler must possess not only virtue, but vigilance. He must read the motives of those around him with precision. He must distinguish between flattery that seeks reward and loyalty that seeks stability. He must monitor the emotional currents circulating through the court. Resentment signals danger. Excessive enthusiasm signals manipulation. Unsolicited counsel signals ambition. Silence signals strategy. The court speaks in a language of implication, and a ruler must be fluent in its grammar. Yet Machiavelli does not advise paranoia. Paranoia destroys judgment. Paranoia drives the ruler to alienate those who could secure his power. Paranoia transforms potential allies into actual enemies. Instead, Machiavelli prescribes strategic distance. The ruler must remain accessible enough to inspire allegiance, but distant enough to maintain authority. Familiarity erodes fear, and without fear, the court behaves as though the throne were vacant. Fear, however, cannot stand alone. Raw intimidation breeds plots. Excessive harshness accelerates betrayal. A ruler must balance fear with benefits, punishment with reward. Ministers must see clearly that service is more profitable than treachery. Machiavelli exposes the psychological economy of power. People remain loyal, not because they love the ruler, but because disloyalty costs more than obedience. If betrayal becomes the safer path, no ruler survives. This economy becomes even more volatile in the world of 2025. Communication moves faster. Factions form invisibly. Alliances mutuate online. Perception becomes currency. A rumor can destabilize confidence. A leaked message can ignite rebellion. A single misinterpreted gesture can fracture internal unity. The ruler no longer guards against conspiracies formed in private chambers. He must anticipate conspiracies that form in digital shadows. The court has expanded into a network, and networks amplify instability. Still, the psychological dynamics remain the same. Those closest to power desire influence. Influence breeds competition. Competition breeds resentment. Resentment breeds betrayal. Machiavelli teaches the ruler not to eliminate ambition, but to manage it. He must distribute power in ways that divide. Potential rivals weaken alliances before they harden. Reward those who stabilize the system and remove those who disrupt it. Politics is not the elimination of conflict. It is the orchestration of conflict in a direction that sustains authority. But Machiavelli also reveals the most subtle threat of all. The ruler's own inner circle can shape his perception of the world. Ministers filter information. Advisors shape interpretation. Ambitious figures distort reality to serve their agendas. If the ruler does not seek multiple sources, if he does not test the motives behind the messages he receives, he becomes blind, governing not the world, but the illusions constructed around him. Many rulers fall not because they lose power, but because they lose awareness. This blindness can descend softly. It begins with comfort. It grows with delegation. It solidifies when the ruler's image becomes more important than the truth he must confront. When surrounded by those who fear displeasing him, he hears only what reinforces his certainties. When surrounded by those who desire his collapse, he hears only what accelerates it. The leader who stops discerning becomes the instrument of his ministers rather than their master. Thus Machiavelli advises a final discipline. The ruler must cultivate a small circle of advisors capable of telling him the truth without fear. These advisors must be loyal, not because they are morally pure, but because their fortunes depend on his stability. Truth becomes possible only when aligned with self-interest. The ruler cannot rely on honesty. He must structure it. Yet even this structure cannot guarantee protection, for power generates envy, and envy generates plots, and plots generate instability. And so Machiavelli leaves the ruler with a paradox that cannot be resolved. He must trust enough to govern effectively, yet distrust enough to survive. He must allow proximity, yet fear it. He must create unity, yet remain apart from it. Power demands closeness and isolation at the same time. The ruler becomes a solitary figure surrounded by voices, none of which can be embraced fully. This solitude is the true cost of power. It corrodes comfort. It distorts intimacy. It imposes a psychological burden that ordinary people cannot fathom. The ruler cannot share weakness. He cannot confide freely. He cannot yield to emotion. He must carry the dual weight of vigilance and authority, even as he stands among those who smile at him with concealed ambition. And as this heavy truth settles, another question begins to emerge, one that threads itself through every layer of Machiavelli's analysis. If the ruler must survive internal enemies, emotional instability, and the fragile loyalty of the court, then what ultimate purpose does power serve? And how does the political animal find meaning in a world where necessity governs more fiercely than virtue? A question that points toward the deeper philosophical terrain where the struggle for power confronts the struggle for purpose itself. And as this heavy truth settles, another question begins to emerge, one that threads itself through every layer of Machiavelli's analysis. If the struggle for power consumes the ruler, if necessity governs more fiercely than virtue, then what remains of purpose? For power without purpose becomes mere survival, and survival without meaning becomes a quiet form of despair. Machiavelli forces us into this space, where the ruler must confront not only enemies and circumstance, but the hollowness that lurks beneath political ambition itself. He begins with a revelation few wish to face. Power does not satisfy the one who holds it. It intoxicates for a moment, then corrodes. Ambition promises fulfillment, yet fulfillment dissolves the moment it is achieved. The ruler stands at the summit only to discover that the summit offers no peace. Each victory creates new threats. Each accomplishment awakens new rivals. Each consolidation of authority generates new fears. Power expands the field of vulnerability rather than shrinking it. Machiavelli understood that the ruler is never secure because security itself is an illusion, and the pursuit of that illusion becomes its own torment. Yet the ruler continues to climb because the alternative is more terrifying. To abandon power is to confront insignificance. To step down is to confronting the self stripped of privilege, stripped of authority, stripped of the symbolic aura that shields him from his own existential emptiness. Machiavelli exposes the deepest contradiction of political life. The ruler is imprisoned by the power he sought to possess. He cannot rest without losing what he holds. He cannot release what he holds without losing who he believes himself to be. This psychological trap is not unique to rulers. The political animal in every human understands it instinctively. We seek influence because we fear irrelevance. We seek control because chaos threatens to dissolve our identity. We seek recognition because being unseen feels like death. Politics magnifies these impulses, but it does not create them. The individual who longs for superiority, the worker seeking advancement, the activist seeking impact, the leader seeking dominion, all share the same root: fear of being no one. Machiavelli understood that politics is simply the grand stage upon which this fear becomes visible. But fear alone cannot explain the hunger for power. Ambition extends deeper, into the realm of meaning. People seek power because they believe it will allow them to shape the world, to leave an imprint, to create permanence in the face of impermanence. The ruler becomes a symbol of this longing, an embodiment of humanity's refusal to accept the fragility of existence. Leadership becomes a form of defiance against mortality. To command the world is to pretend, even briefly, that one is not subject to the world's indifference. Yet Machiavelli dismantles this illusion as mercilessly as he dismantles every other. No leader escapes mortality. No empire resists decay. No legacy remains untouched by reinterpretation, distortion, or oblivion. The ruler who builds monuments to himself builds them on shifting ground. The meaning he seeks dissolves the moment fortune turns or public sentiment changes. Posterity is not gratitude, it is accident. Machiavelli forces the ruler and us to confront that will alone cannot guarantee remembrance. The struggle for meaning through power is a wager against time, and time always wins. Still, Machiavelli does not advocate nihilism. He does not suggest that purpose is impossible, only that purpose cannot be borrowed from illusions. The ruler cannot find meaning in validation, admiration, or historical permanence. He must locate it within the discipline of confronting reality without retreating into fantasy. Meaning becomes the courage to act without the comfort of guarantees. Meaning becomes the choice to navigate necessity with clarity rather than delusion. Machiavelli elevates the ruler not through morality, but through lucidity, the willingness to see the world stripped of comforting lies. In this way, political purpose shifts from external achievement to internal mastery. The ruler acts not to fulfill the fantasies of power, but to fulfill the responsibility inherent in holding it. Responsibility, not glory, becomes the closest thing to meaning that political life can offer. Responsibility forces the ruler to carry burdens others cannot carry. Responsibility demands decisions that fracture the self. Responsibility exposes the ruler to judgment, hatred, and misunderstanding. And yet, responsibility becomes the thread that holds the political world together. But the cost of this purpose is solitude. No one outside the throne understands the weight of necessity. The people imagine the ruler's life as privilege. Rivals imagine it as opportunity. Admirers imagine it as fulfillment. Only the ruler feels the psychological fractures beneath the surface, the constant tension between public expectation and private truth. Power isolates not because others withdraw, but because the ruler must conceal the full measure of his knowledge. He cannot reveal doubt. He cannot reveal fear. He cannot reveal the internal struggle that accompanies every decision. Solitude becomes his invisible companion. Machiavelli understood that this solitude is inevitable. Political responsibility demands a level of awareness incompatible with ordinary belonging. The ruler sees the world as it is, and this sight separates him from others who require illusion to function. To stand in truth is to stand alone. And yet, this solitude becomes the condition under which purpose emerges. Only in isolation can the ruler confront the reality that power is not the answer to the human condition. It is merely one terrain upon which the condition expresses itself. This realization opens a deeper philosophical wound. If neither success nor legacy nor public approval can fulfill the ruler, then what remains for him? What sustains him when the illusions of power fade? Machiavelli offers no comforting resolution. He does not propose a moral transcendence. He does not promise inner peace. Instead, he pushes us toward a new threshold, the recognition that meaning may not lie in power itself, but in understanding the forces that shape it. The ruler becomes a student of human nature, and this knowledge, though heavy, becomes a form of clarity unavailable to ordinary lives. Yet this clarity cuts sharply. For once the ruler sees human nature in its raw form, fear, ambition, frailty, longing, he cannot unsee it. Every relationship becomes an interpretation of instinct. Every gesture becomes a signal. Every alliance becomes a temporary balance of pressures. The world loses its innocence. And perhaps this is the final price of political life. To understand humanity so deeply that one becomes estranged from it. And as Machiavelli leads us to this edge, he does not soften the descent. Instead, he gestures toward the final realm of the prince's struggle, where the question of purpose dissolves into a more piercing confrontation. If power cannot save the ruler from solitude or mortality, then what remains for him to master except the truth of his own nature? A question that pulls us into the last and most intimate dimension of Machiavelli's thought, where the battlefield is no longer the state, nor the people, nor the court, but the ruler's inner self. And as Machiavelli leads us to this edge, where the prince confronts not the state, nor the people, nor the forces of fortune, but the truth of his own nature, another, deeper revelation begins to surface. The greatest battlefield is inward. For no matter how fiercely a ruler masters others, no matter how effectively he outmaneuvers rivals or navigates public volatility, he remains bound to a struggle that no boy strategy can fully contain. The struggle between the self he performs and the self he cannot escape. The ruler becomes fractured, not by failure, but by insight. He sees too much, understands too much, feels the weight of necessity pressing against the fragile architecture of identity. Machiavelli forces the leader into this interior confrontation. He demands that the prince recognize the gulf between what he must do and what he wishes he could be. Virtue equips him to act with decisiveness, to discipline instinct, to bend fortune, to control perception. But virtue cannot silence the internal conflict that arises when action violates desire, when necessity violates conscience, when the performance of power violates the remnants of the moral self. The ruler becomes his own adversary, negotiating the demands of external survival with the demands of internal coherence. And coherence becomes impossible. For the ruler must lie to others, but he must also lie to himself. He must justify decisions that burden him. He must silence emotions that threaten him. He must fragment identity in order to maintain authority. This fragmentation is not weakness. It is structural. It is the architecture required to bear the weight of leadership. Machiavelli does not hide this truth. He exposes it ruthlessly. To rule is to wound oneself continuously. Every strategic decision cuts into the moral fabric of the self. Every calculated gesture deepens the gap between private truth and public necessity. And the ruler must endure these wounds without succumbing to them. But endurance alone does not solve the deeper existential pain Machiavelli points to. The prince must live with awareness that he can never be fully known. He cannot reveal his fears, his doubts, his longing for simplicity, his exhaustion. Even his own victories isolate him further, because triumph increases expectation, and expectation breeds anxiety. The ruler becomes a solitary figure, even in crowded rooms. Condemned, performs strength while privately confronting his own fragility. And perhaps this is Machiavelli's most haunting insight. The more power a man gains, the less of himself he is permitted to keep. This erosion of self is not merely psychological, it is existential. The prince begins to question whether the person he has become is the result of choice or the result of necessity. Machiavelli suggests that the ruler who clings to the illusion of moral autonomy will crumble. The effective ruler accepts that necessity shapes him more than intention does. He becomes what the world requires, not what he privately imagines. This acceptance is brutal, but it grants a strange clarity. The ruler ceases expecting harmony between his desires and his duties. He learns to carry contradiction as part of his identity. Yet even this clarity does not protect him from the corrosive effects of power. For power bends the world, but also bends the self. It rewards calculation over tenderness, vigilance over trust, adaptation over stability. The ruler begins to wonder whether anything remains untouched by necessity, whether he still possesses a private realm of authenticity, or whether every emotion has been repurposed for survival, whether he can still feel for himself or only for advantage, whether virtue in the conventional sense has become impossible. Machiavelli makes no attempt to rescue him from these questions. He offers no solace, only recognition that this tension is the price of leadership. In the world of 2025, this tension intensifies. The modern leader is exposed to relentless scrutiny, forced to perform identity continuously. unable to retreat into privacy long enough to reconnect with the self beneath the mask. The digital world collapses the boundary between public image and private being. The leader is consumed not only by political necessity, but by psychological hyper-visibility. His own reflection becomes a prison, distorted by millions of interpretations. Machiavelli's prince faced the court. Today's prince faces the world. And the world demands performance without interruption. This expands the existential burden. The modern ruler must sustain an identity that pleases the people, satisfies the elite, counters rivals, navigates global networks, and survives the volatile rhythms of public emotion. The self becomes a shifting instrument, tailored to context, stripped of constancy. Machiavelli would see this not as deviation, but as intensification of the ancient dilemma. The prince must become a plurality of selves to survive. And yet, he must also maintain an internal core strong enough to prevent psychological collapse. Too much fragmentation leads to incoherence. Too much coherence leads to inflexibility. The prince must live suspended between these poles, never fully anchored, never fully free. But within this turmoil lies the final truth Machiavelli offers. The only mastery the ruler can achieve is mastery over his own relationship with necessity. He cannot control fortune entirely. He cannot control the people completely. He cannot eliminate rivals permanently. But he can confront himself honestly. He can understand the forces shaping him. He can refuse to be destroyed by the contradictions inherent in his role. This is not transcendence. It is resilience. A resilience rooted in lucidity rather than illusion. Yet this lucidity carries a price. To see oneself without illusion is to stand exposed before one's own emptiness. The prince begins to realize that power cannot fill the void at the center of existence. It cannot resolve the longing for meaning, for stability, for authenticity. Power magnifies the void rather than shrinking it. Meaning must come from somewhere deeper than dominance. Machiavelli does not prescribe where meaning lies. He leaves the prince standing in the tension, aware that the quest for purpose is not answered by ruling others, but by confronting the fragile being who rules. And as this awareness settles, it begins to reshape the very concept of political life. For once the prince understands that he cannot escape himself, he also understands that the state he governs is a reflection of the human condition. Conflict mirrors inner division. Instability mirrors existential uncertainty. Ambition mirrors fear of insignificance. The political world becomes an externalization of the psychological world. To rule effectively becomes inseparable from understanding the fractures of human nature, others and his own. This recognition opens the door to the final movement of Machiavelli's philosophical trajectory, where the prince must grapple not only with power, perception, fortune, or identity, but with the deeper question that has always haunted leadership. What remains of humanity when necessity has consumed everything else? And in that question, something unresolved stirs, preparing the prince to face the truth that lies beyond Machiavellian strategy. Truth not about politics, but about existence itself. Machiavelli closes his hands around the illusion we cling to and crushes it slowly, forcing us to watch the fragments fall. He was never trying to teach humanity how to be wicked. He was trying to strip away the disguises we wrap around our nature. He understood that morality collapses when it refuses to confront the instincts that govern us. He understood that politics falls into chaos when leaders mistake their ideals for reality. He understood that societies fracture not because people are evil, but because people refuse to see what they truly are. His legacy is not a manual for manipulation, nor a celebration of cruelty. It is a demand for clarity, a demand that we stop comforting ourselves with stories about how power should work and instead examine how it actually works. A demand that we stop imagining leaders as embodiments of virtue and start understanding them as human beings, navigating fear, desire, ambition, belonging,
and instability. A demand that we recognize that every system, no matter how noble its language, is built on the shifting sands of human psychology. Machiavelli tells us that ethics cannot save a system built on denial. He tells us that political structures collapse when they ignore the instincts that pulse beneath their surface. He tells us that leaders fail not because they are immoral, but because they are naive. Power does not respond to purity. Power responds to understanding. But he also tells us something more unsettling. He tells us that the world cannot be healed by pretending it is gentler than it is. He tells us that illusions are the softest form of tyranny because they prevent us from seeing the forces that shape us. And once we refuse illusion, we are left with the hardest question of all. What does it mean to live honestly within a world that does not reward honesty? Perhaps this is Machiavelli's true contribution. Not the tactics of princes, not the strategies of statesmen, not the warnings of the battlefield or the calculations of the court, but the simple recognition that wisdom begins the moment we stop lying to ourselves. He reminds us that human beings do not break because they encounter the truth. They break because they spend their lives running from it. And when the illusions fall, when the narratives dissolve, when we finally look at power, politics, belief, and ourselves without the filters that make them easier to bear, one question rises with quiet brutality. Do we want to live in a world that feels beautiful or a world that is true? A question Machiavelli never answers for us, because he understood that the answer reveals not the nature of power, but the nature of the one who is willing to face it.